from this, because China can use peace regime to claim its historical place as a regional hegemon and attempt to restructure the regional order in China's strategic interests. And China joining peace regime, peace treaty as a signatory could kind of legitimize China's right to interfere with the future of the Korean Peninsula. And I think this is something that we have to think about. Sorry for taking too long.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. The next presenter is Dr. Tong Zhao, who is a fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program of the Carnegie-Endowment for the International Peace. Is based in Beijing. So he will talk about the future of international security in Northeast Asia. Please welcome Dr. Tong Zhao.
It's very hard to follow Ambassador Trump. He also mentioned China will be the winner. Looking forward to thank you. I look forward to discuss and debate those arguments. For my presentation, I will start with I think I will start with pessimistic assessment about the future prospects of North Korean denuclearization. My personal view is North Korea doesn't have any real intention to surrender its nuclear weapons in the foreseeable future. North Korea clearly has a two-stage strategy in pursuing nuclear capabilities. In stage one, it quickly acquired a rudimentary nuclear deterrent capability, and then in stage two, it moved on to focus on economic development and to develop a normal relationship with the outside world. So I think we are probably looking at a decades-long denuclearization process. However, I have to note that in China, the view about this is very diversified. Some Chinese experts do believe that if US is willing to provide sufficient security guarantee, North Korea is ready to make a grand bargain by trading off its nuclear deterrent capability. And some Chinese scholars even argue that if the American-led denuclearization process failed, China can take the lead and start a China-led denuclearization process. But personally, I'm very skeptical. I don't see how China can succeed in doing that if the US is not capable of imposing enough coercive pressure to force North Korea to denuclearize. Where does Chinese leverage over North Korean nuclear decision come from? I think looking to the future, North Korea probably is going to try to prolong this negotiation for as much as possible. In this process, North Korea might gradually offer some small and limited concessions little by little. The purpose is to keep the Americans at the negotiating table, do not walk away, do not walk back to the fire and fury rhetoric, do not go back to the preemptive military strike options, but with North Korea offering incremental but small concessions, especially in the direction of freezing and capping its nuclear and missile capabilities. North Korea wants to prolong this negotiation process and therefore making it a de facto nuclear capable power country for as long as possible. I think we should focus our attention very much on how to address the secondary security implications of a nuclear-capable North Korea for the years and decades to come. If my understanding is correct, which is North Korea is going to retain a certain part of its nuclear deterrent capability for a very long time, then it's almost certain that the United States and its regional allies would continue their military cooperation, and it might even enhance their military cooperation by deploying more deterrence capabilities against North Korea in the future. And those military cooperation, those military deployments will for sure be viewed by China and Russia as well as a serious threat to Beijing and Moscow. Two things would stand out very quickly. One is the missile defense cooperation, which China and Russia believe very much undermine their nuclear deterrent capability with the United States. And also, we all know North Korea still has a submarine-launched ballistic missile program, and therefore, if that threat continues, U.S. and its regional allies might continue their anti-submarine warfare cooperation, which might be seen as an increasing threat to Beijing, especially as China is now putting more emphasis on the importance of its sea-based nuclear deterrent. Especially over the issue of missile defense, it has generated a lot of paranoia in Russia and China. If we recall that earlier this year, President Putin publicized a number of new strategic weapons developed by Russia. And one important incentive behind those new developments was because the United States withdrew from the ABM treaty. And Russia since then has been working on those capabilities in order to counter American missile defense. And I think China will see basically the similar reaction from China too. And especially with South Korea, China has already responded extremely strongly to the deployment of THAAD missile defense system in South Korea. By following Chinese domestic discussion over this issue and by interacting with my Chinese colleagues, my understanding of what happened about THAAD was basically pre-existing distrust in China towards the United States, greatly influenced and biased Chinese understanding about the technical capability of the missile defense system, especially the radar system. And that technical misunderstanding further contributed to even greater political distrust in Beijing towards the United States. So it's a very sad story, but I'm afraid as the North Korean nuclear capability continues into the future, we are going to see repetitions of the THAAD issue, of the THAAD dispute in the future. In fact, this is already happening. Japan just announced the plan to introduce the American Aegis Ashore missile defense system, and as part of that program, Japan is going to introduce the very capable long-range discrimination radar to support these interceptors. And there are already Chinese technical scholars focusing on this issue and highlighting their conclusion that this radar is very powerful and can very much undermine Chinese nuclear deterrent vis-a-vis the United States. We are now waiting for the US to publicize its long overdue missile defense review report, but there is every sign to believe that in this report, the US will continue investing more resources into developing and deploying more advanced missile assets, including in this region. So that will for sure generate even more threat perception in Beijing. So I think after Singapore summit, this problem caused by North Korea's nuclear problem, caused by North Korea's nuclear capability between the big powers in this region, between China, South Korea, China, Japan, China, United States, this phenomenon is going to exacerbate. Because after Singapore, China would argue that now look, North Korea has taken concrete efforts, including tearing down the nuclear test site, the Seoul missile engine test stand, and other measures to limit and restrain its capability. So there is much less reason for US, South Korea, and Japan to deploy missile defense. But from the US, Japan, and South Korean perspective, the threat still is still there. So it's likely they will still have this incentive to enhance their missile defense capability. So it's harder, it will become harder and harder for Beijing and other countries in this region, US, Japan, and South Korea, to agree about how much missile defense is justified. So we at Carnegie, Toby led this research effort. I participated, another Japanese scholar also contributed, and we discussed some of these secondary security issues. And I think that's going to be a major problem in this region, and we are certainly welcome you all to download for free and read. And there is also this issue of geopolitics. Increasingly, it appears that China looks at the North Korea issue from the geopolitical perspective. When North Korea and the United States finally started to directly talk to each other, China quickly became very concerned about itself being marginalized in this process, being sidelined, losing control in the future direction. And China has, for a long time, embraced very deep distrust toward both North Korea and the United States. For North Korea, China understands very well. North Korea doesn't like China, North Korea hates China, North Korea doesn't want to depend on China for its security. And if there's a chance, North Korea wants to develop a better relationship with the United States. And for the United States, China always worries that the US has a long-term incentive to contain China, etc., etc. So it doesn't trust anyone. So for China, when it sees that the North Korean and the US relationship is getting closer and has an opportunity to even get better, the worry becomes, how do we make sure that North Korea in the future would continue to have a closer relationship with us than with the United States? In other words, preventing North Korea being absorbed into the American orbit in the future becomes the #1 strategic priority. So what I'm saying is, as progress is made on the diplomatic front, this geopolitical concern silently grows. And it could have a greater influence in the future. So as China-US strategic rivalry grows, I'm worried that this will make future US-China cooperation to address North Korea nuclear crisis even much less likely. Thank you. And I think for North Korea actually, its strategy is dependent on this persistent US-China competition. I don't think North Korea wants to depend its security on the goodwill trust, on the goodwill gesture, goodwill security guarantee from anyone. But it wants to depend its security on the inevitable and persistent mutual distrust and mutual suspicion between US and China in the long run. In other words, I think the North Korean strategy in the long run is to keep relatively normal relations with both of the two big powers in this region, China and the United States, and to keep a relatively equal distance with both. And if one big power starts to threaten North Korea would shift a little closer to the other big power. So that's the way it builds, it depends on its security and making sure that it gets to keep its nuclear weapons without making fundamental concessions. And there are other factors that will make this big power competition even more intense in the future. One is, I think there is greater ideological competition between US and China. This current Chinese leadership has very different ideologies from the United States. And in China, we increasingly emphasize the importance of self-confidence in our own ideology, in our own way of development, etc. So I think this clear and different ideology is going to contribute very much to increasing threat perception. Because if two powers clearly don't share the same values, that's the best way for them to distrust each other. So that will be a fundamental driver of increasing geopolitical rivalry between the two big powers. And also, I think China, even though economically wants to be more open, wants to be more connected with outside world, politically speaking, China is becoming more closed in terms of the domestic political environment. And that's troublesome because that makes free and open policy debates unlikely. And that's a recipe for nationalist and hawkish foreign policy views to dominate the domestic rhetoric, and that's a recipe for very bad policy making into the future. So the implication for regional security is that I think in addition to a growing US-China rivalry, I think there's the China-Japan relationship, especially in the security area, will also become more competitive. And in the contrary, Russia and China will become closer strategically, and maybe they will also have closer relations with DPRK in the future. And South Korea, I think, is in a very difficult position because it will face pressure from both sides. Thank you. Last slide. To conclude and to look into the future, I think our focus, the focus of regional countries should be on damage limitation. We should not be too ambitious in setting our goals. We should be realistic. The priority for near term should be damage limitation. One is to manage the secondary security implications of a nuclear capable North Korea for the foreseeable future, as I explained before. And secondly, how to contain growing arms race between the big powers. If we're talking about promoting disarmament, etc., I think those are two ambitious goals. We should first to avoid arms race, which is a more urgent threat to regional stability. Secondly, clearly, there is growing political distrust between regional countries, including between big powers. And the only way, I think, to mitigate that political distrust is to work on their technical disagreements on their disputes. In the example of that dispute, clearly their political disagreement has a deep root in their different and divergent understandings about the technical capabilities of a specific system. So the only hope, if we want to resolve this, is to devote enough efforts, probably in the form of a joint technical research, to try to reduce their disagreement on these relatively neutral technical issues. And if that can be done, I think that's the only hope, that we can gradually resolve each small dispute and then over time mitigate political distrust. And as I said before, some countries are becoming, are living in an environment of self-imposed seclusion. And that's a fundamental source of dispute and distrust. And given this, we should even devote even more efforts to sustain exchanges at all levels in order to break this self-imposed seclusion and to promote better mutual understanding. And in this regard, I really commend the efforts of NEREC to contribute to exchanges of views among different countries on important issues in this region. So that not very optimistic sentiment, let me conclude. Thanks.